The heightened tensions between China, Taiwan and the United States pose one of the biggest geopolitical risks at this moment. And no one's quite certain about what happens next. To get a sense of the various scenarios that could unravel from here on, I'm joined on this broadcast live from the United States by Ian Bremmer, leading political scientist, author. He teaches at Columbia University, columnist at Time, president of the Eurasia Group and one of the world's leading experts on political risk. He's the founder of the Eurasia Group. So his task is really to look at all the risks as they unfold across the world and get a sense of what could happen next at a time when nobody really knows the answer to that. So Ian Bremmer, welcome. It's good to connect after the World Economic Forum.
Good to see you. Good to see you.
We have at this moment a very dangerous situation that seems to be building with China flexing its military muscles around Taiwan. Where do you see the situation go from here? The biggest question when it comes to risk at this moment is, could this muscle flexing in some way escalate into military confrontation?
Look, whenever you have these sorts of unprecedented military exercises and activities, people can always miscalculate, you can always have a mistake, and that's a very dangerous time. But I do want to be clear that the Biden administration has itself tried hard to deliver a message that the intention of the United States is not to change its long-stated policy of strategic ambiguity. Speaker Pelosi, her trip was obviously very provocative. Biden did not want her to go, but once she decided she was going anyway, she did take steps to try to limit how much of a confrontation could come from it. So, for example, she took a much longer flight route to Taiwan to avoid flying through or over contested airspace in the South China Sea. When she was in Taiwan, she explicitly acknowledged that she supports the U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity. There was nothing new in the statements that Pelosi had made on the ground in Taiwan or during her meeting with President Tsai Ing-wen. So from the American side, again, this trip itself is a provocation. The trip itself comes at a time that is seen as a loss of face by the Chinese. They had warned the Americans, so they are going to take escalatory steps in return, in retaliation. But I do think that while we're seeing escalation, we are not seeing an effort to create a crisis by China, and there is calibration in the steps that have been announced to date by the mainland Chinese so far.
Is this where it could stop? Because we've seen some additional bans on Taiwanese exports to China, but as you said, it hasn't been hugely escalatory and definitely not from a military perspective. Given that President Xi has a big Communist Party Congress coming up in October, will economic sanctions and some military maneuvers suffice, or do you think he's just building it up to something more ominous?
Look, I think it will suffice for now. These are the most significant military operations that the Chinese government have taken. And I mean, they exceed what we saw during the 1995-96 Taiwan crisis, and were clearly intended to be seen as such by the Chinese government. And again, if you're doing live fire missile exercises over the Taiwanese land, then there's a possibility that something can screw up and people can get killed. So, I mean, you are taking calculated risks here. I don't want to underestimate the importance of that. You've got, both sides on military high alert. There's always the possibility that something goes wrong. But you're right that I think that by itself is probably sufficient in terms of the immediate Chinese reaction. There is a bigger question about during the Party Congress, will the Chinese government change unilaterally what they consider to be acceptable and unacceptable forms of Taiwanese self-governance in terms of the business community, in terms of pressure on the ruling DPP, I think that those things are indeed possible. And, you know, it's an interesting dynamic here about who it is we need to watch more closely in this tense relationship, Taiwan, China, or the United States. I would argue that the most uncertain player down the road is actually the United States. This crisis came because President Biden was unable to convince a senior member of his own party to go along with his foreign policy. She just decided that she's 82 years old, she's almost done with her political career, and she was going to make a statement. Didn't matter if her president agreed with her or not. And the Chinese see that as both an escalation, but also an opportunity for them to essentially put Taiwan in a more difficult position without risking further American pushback, because they know the Biden administration doesn't want that. I think we can see more of that going forward. Let me go forward to 2024. What would happen if, in that case, the United States government had a constitutional crisis in the upcoming election, and for a period of weeks or months we don't really know who the president is, and you have some really strong and hostile statements about China and Taiwan that are being made, for example, on the Republican side at that point. I could see the Chinese seeing that as a big opportunity to further change the status quo in their favor. In other words, if the provocations come from the U.S., the feeling of opportunity that the Americans are incapable of acting coherently comes from the U.S., and that's when China, led all the way through by Xi Jinping with a long-term perspective that, you know, they're going to reunify Taiwan into the mainland by hook or by crook, this is their chance to shake the branches and see if any fruit falls off. That's not an amphibious military invasion. That's not a sudden taking over of Taiwan, but it is absolutely these salami tactics where whenever they see an opportunity, they're going to grab a little bit more. That is, I think, what we're seeing today is the precursor of the way this is likely to play out from China's perspective over a long period of time.